70% of those who ended up in the African diaspora from what is known as the Bight of Biafra were Igbo speaking. Right? So, they constitute a very important part of what is today known as the African diaspora. Perhaps in a state like Virginia in the United States, 60% of black Virginians have Igbo ancestry. The same with Cuba, right? So, I'm looking at those two forms of migration and to think and understand why the Igbo is important in assessing those migrations and their outcome.
What if everything you've been told about the origins of the Igbo people is only half the story? What if beneath the centuries of migration, myth, and memories lies a deeper connection? One that links the Igbo not just to a region, but to some of Africa's earliest Aboriginal settlers. For generations, questions have lingered. Where did the Igbo truly come from? Were they always where they are today, or part of much older, wider movement of people across the African continent? Today, we step beyond textbooks and into the shadows of forgotten history, because this is not just about the origins. This is about the identity. This is about connection. This is about uncovering a past that was never completely lost, only hidden. Join Professor Chima J. Corey as he unveils the threads of time, tracing the roots of the Igbo people and exploring their possible links to Africa's earliest inhabitants. Prepare to question what you thought you knew, because history is about to speak to all of us.
What is important, of course, is to understand how the Igbo people were critical to these two levels of migration. Internal within Africa, external within the African diaspora. And I mean by the word here, diaspora, if you look at what is today the United States, Trinidad and Tobago, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, there's a large proportion of black people in those parts of the world. What is important for us is to think about how those people ended up in what is today referred to as the New World or the Americas. Perhaps 70% of those who ended up in the African diaspora from what is known as the Bight of Biafra were Igbo speaking. Right? So, they constitute a very important part of what is today known as the African diaspora. Perhaps in a state like Virginia in the United States, 60% of black Virginians have Igbo ancestry. The same with Cuba. Right? So, I'm looking at those two forms of migration and to think and understand why the Igbo is important in assessing those migrations and their outcome. So let me place some, lay some emphasis on the Bantu migration, which occurred within Africa. And when I talk about the Bantu migration, I want you to look at it from a linguistic point of view. How and why is the Igbo language related to Kikuyu, spoken in East Africa? How is the Igbo language related to Xhosa, spoken in Southern Africa? Right? How is it related to so many other languages in what is Sub-Saharan Africa? Linguistically, the Igbo speak a language that belongs to the larger family of languages known as Bantu or Niger-Congo. There's close to 100 million people across Sub-Saharan Africa speak these languages or related languages, collectively known as Bantu languages. How did this happen? What does the Igbo have in common with Kikuyu, as I mentioned earlier, Xhosa, etc.? They share a common linguistic affinity. Scholars have explained this through the phenomenon known as Bantu migration or Bantu expansion. By 1000 BC, In a series of migrations, Bantu speakers had spread south of the savannah, across Angola, and to the great lake regions of East Africa. Over the next 1,500 years, they scattered throughout the Central and Southern Africa, interacting with indigenous people and absorbing those indigenous people as they moved along. Their migration throughout Africa is one of the largest migrations in human history. A migration that began 1000 BC and continued to the 4th century AD. It can be speculated that the ancestors of the Igbo were part of these Proto-Bantu speakers whose knowledge of agriculture, especially tuber production, yam production, and iron working technology helped to people and colonize the rest of the subcontinent. If I had mentioned, the Leger, right? Iron works, which I think is phenomenal. If you go to Leger in Nsukka, that people were already working iron smelting here, centuries back. Those skills were very central. And the knowledge of yam production, in the way the Igbo people began to expand and leave this area as they seek new opportunities for agriculture and absorbing indigenous people they encounter. Some of you may come across, if you look at Central Africa, the people they call the pygmies, right? Have you heard the word pygmies of the Congo, right? Those are indigenous people that these Bantu speakers, with their superior agricultural knowledge and iron technology, were able to absorb those people. But their language never remained sort of like Igbo. They incorporated other words from those existing languages. But what is important in terms of understanding the Proto-Bantu languages is that there are elements of those proto-languages that have been retained, right, in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, we use the word Omo, right, to refer to children of Omuchieze, Omodis. Most Bantu speakers have the same prefix, Ba for people, right, Bakongo, and so on and so forth. So, a number of theories have been put forward to explain this migration. There is speculations that overpopulation encouraged some groups to move to new places in search of fertile land and in order to practice agriculture. It is important to emphasize that both the development of agriculture and the existence of unusually high population density have been a defining character of Igbo land even to today. The long history of plant domestication is evident in the large variety of food crops and edible plants in Igbo society. The variety of crops and plants attest to the antiquity of agriculture in Igbo region, including plants like, Africa rice, Guinea corn, Hungary rice, Bambara groundnut, etc., okra, and many, many others that were domesticated in this area and gave these migrants the skills and tools they use in expanding and conquering the rest of the continent. Now, accounts of captives of Igbo origin in the New World provide an unusual and rare glimpse into the agricultural and exchange economy of the Igbo. If you look at the walls over there, there's a picture of an Igbo ex-slave known as Olaudia Equiano. Has anybody heard about Olaudia Equiano? Right? No? Okay. So Olaudia Equiano was born in an Igbo village in 1745 and was sold into slavery when he was 11 years. Equiano recorded later when he wrote his autobiography in 1799, he recorded life and livelihood in his village. There are speculations that it comes from Iseke, which is today in Ihiala. And he talked about agriculture, 18th century, that agriculture is our chief employment, and everyone, even the children and women, are engaged in it. Thus, we have a habit of labor from our earliest years. Equiano's description of Igbo society and the economy in the 18th century is supported by accounts given by other Igbo slaves in the Americas. Another Igbo slave in Jamaica, known as Archibald Montet, was born in 1799 in Igbo land and was enslaved in Jamaica. He affirmed in his memoir that yams, potatoes, and Indian corn were an integral part of Igbo agriculture in the 17th and 18th century. 19th century accounts offer more perspective. In his journey to Bonny in 1840, Hermann Kohl, a German doctor, noticed that the Igbo exported agricultural produce and metal goods to Bonny. He described the Igbo as rich in natural products, including maize, rice, yam, oil or palm oil, dyewood, and cotton, and was quite indispensable in providing staple food to Bonny. Bonny is in the riverine area, right? W.E. Crew, who visited in Nsukka in 1866, was impressed by the abundance of agricultural produce, and he described that in the market they abound in corn, palm oil, palm wine, fish, deer, meat, dog, and other products like fowl, tobacco, eggs, and yams. What I'm trying to emphasize is the importance of understanding the antiquity of agriculture in Igbo land. And it is this skill of agriculture and iron technology that enabled the Proto-Bantu speakers, which includes the Igbo, to expand and people what is today sub-Saharan Africa. Am I making sense? So, if you look at what is today sub-Saharan Africa from here to South Africa, this is the migration that began from this region and continued over thousands of years. That people didn't reach the Zulu, the Swana, the Soto, the Ndebele. They didn't reach what is today South Africa until about the 9th century. Not too long ago. That migration pattern began here some 5,000 years ago. So we can't understand the making of sub-Saharan Africa without really thinking and understanding the role of the Igbo and other Proto-Bantu speakers in what is today, right, West Africa, in the area of Nigeria and Cameroon. Let me go to the second point, which is, if you look at the Americas, which includes the United States and the Caribbeans, there's a long history which began when the Europeans emerged in West Africa in the 15th century, seeking gold, trying to buy gold, which was abundant in West Africa, and which formed an integral part of the trade between West Africa, North Africa, and the Mediterranean world up to the 15th century. By the 15th century, the Portuguese became interested in having a direct access to the gold of West Africa rather than buying from the Arab middlemen, right, who brought the gold from across the Sahara. This exploration of West Africa opened up opportunity for the first time for direct contact between Europeans and Africans. Imagine in West Africa to demand or to seek gold created the first opportunity for Europeans to begin also to trade and enslave, Africans. So the Atlantic slave trade began from the 15th, 16th century due to this contact between Africans and Europeans. Why is this of interest to us? If you look at the areas involved in the Atlantic slave trade, it is from the area of Senegal today to the coast of Angola, South and Southwest Africa. By the 17th century to the 18th century, most of those being enslaved into the New World was coming from what is today the Bight of Biafra, right? Bono, Calabar, you're right, and others. But most of the enslaved people were coming from the hinterland, from Igbo land, facilitated by the Aro, right, using the Ibinukwabi. What is my interest here is perhaps to think about how the New World changed, because out of the number of enslaved people that came to the New World, there's estimate that perhaps 11% of those came from the Bight of Biafra and were Igbo. So in many important ways, this large number of Igbo people from the Bight of Biafra became very significant in terms of shaping New World culture. You can look at the map here to the table, to think about different areas where people from the Bight of Biafra, or mostly Igbo people, ended, and the percentage of those in the New World. So, as the evidence suggests, the large number of enslaved Africans from the Bight of Biafra were Igbo. David Eltis and Richardson estimate that about 1 in 7 Africans shipped to the New World during the era of the slave trade came from the Bight of Biafra, was Igbo speaking. This corresponds to about 11.9% of the total number, for which we have data today. Douglas Chambers suggests that about 11.6 million people were estimated to have been shipped to the New World between 1470 and 1860, and 1.7 million of those were transported from the Bight of Biafra. If his estimate is correct, it means that 80% of those shipped from Calabar, Bonnet to the New World were Igbo speaking. From a transatlantic perspective, and when compared with other, like the Yoruba, the Ewe, and many others, we do not have a lot of history of these Igbo people in the New World. In fact, we do not get a sense that the Igbo, to a very large extent, contributed greatly to the making of New World culture. What is important to emphasize, of course, is why is this the case? If you go to Bahia in Brazil, there's still people who practice traditional Yoruba religion. So when you look at the Atlantic world, you think, oh, it's a Yoruba that's sort of made up, right, the Atlantic world. Even though there were more Igbo people that were enslaved than many other groups. Why is this the case? My argument is that, for one thing, we have to understand why the Igbo and Igbo identity was largely suppressed in the New World. We come from an area, the Igbo come from an area where the nature of the political institution is very republican. The Igbo didn't have a history of centralized power and authority, right? The idea that Igbo enweze. So that individualism shaped Igbo response to slavery. And I can tell you a few history of American planters advising slavers not to bring people from the Bight of Biafra because they didn't make good slaves. Right? their response to slavery was quite different from many other groups from West Africa. Why? They thought the Igbo were a bad investment. They thought the Igbo were more susceptible to suicide. Many of them preferred to kill themselves rather than be slaves. I'm not sure if many people are familiar with the phenomenon, it's 200 years now, called Igbo landing in Georgia, where Igbo slaves were brought to the New World in Georgia, and they went in mass, right, in chains to the sea to drown rather than be slaves. So many planters didn't want people from the Bight of Biafra because it was bad investment. They didn't make good slaves. So you have descriptions in planters' diaries advising slavers in West Africa, do not buy people with fair skin. They are likely coming from the Bight of Biafra, right? They're likely Igbo. Compared with many other enslaved people, most Igbo people were fair-skinned. That if you go to Jamaica today, you're fair-skinned, they call you Red Igbo. Because most of them who came into those areas were of Igbo origin. So what is important, I think, to think about here is how this Igbo identity shaped slavery and the New World. One, I want to emphasize one thing, that if you look the accounts of rebellions throughout the Atlantic world, rebellions occurred where there was a large concentration of Igbo slaves. In Jamaica, in Haiti. Haiti was probably 60% Igbo. Haiti is the only part of the Western Atlantic world where enslaved people rose, right, conquered slavers, and established a black republic. So, Jamaica, the same thing. This, of course, gives us a window into understanding what Fisher calls power waves. How did the Igbo respond to slavery, and how did their response shape the institution of slavery? But let me speak to a little bit to some of the cultural impact that the Igbo brought to the New World that is still enduring today and shapes what we can talk about as American culture. We talked about the Igbo people as a young people at heart. If you have read Things Fall Apart, right? It makes this very evident. When we talked about the Bantu migration, I talked about why yam and the knowledge of yam and agriculture was central to the Igbo, transmitting, expanding throughout what is today West Africa and shaping sub-Saharan Africa. The Igbo transmitted aspects of their culture, including the yam culture. Here we have Ayajoko, right? But in places like Cuba, they have what they call Jonkonu, which is basically Ayajoko lecture. Ayajoko ceremony. Transmitting them into the New World that today they are part of New World culture and ideas and religion. There are certain crops that were brought into the New World, into the Caribbeans, that were of Igbo origin. I mentioned okra, right? Okra, the food culture that in many ways shapes the New World today, have some origin in Africa. Not just, the Igbo, but the ideas about cultivation of things like rice were introduced by the Angolan slaves and things like that. So the Igbo have been central and important in understanding and shaping the New World. Douglas Chamber identifies evidence of what he calls Igboisms in Anglophone American society, which includes Igbo dietary habits. Okra, for example, a staple of Igbo diet, was one pot soup, was identified as Igbo in origin. The vegetal parts of American food, culture, or what is called soul food today in southern United States, indicate a strong Igbo presence in Anglophone slave foodways. Most importantly, were yams, black-eyed beans, and greens. These were the basic food crops in 19th century and early 20th century Igbo society. In the diaspora, the Igbo continued to grow yams and maintain nearly all the secondary subsistence crops of their ancestral villages and agriculture. There's clear evidence of Igbo influence in power ways, or what Fisher has identified as attitude towards power and authority, and the patterns of political participation. Slaves in America drew on similar social resources in order to order their individual and collective lives. Though there were no major slave rebellions in areas such as the Chesapeake and Western Jamaica, where there was a strong Igbo presence, Igbo slaves tended to resort to more forms or other forms of resistance, including suicide, escape, concessional negotiations that in many ways shaped the slave culture and society. I talked a little bit about the John Canoe and other masquerade festivals that have their origin in West Africa that are still practiced in the New World today. The tradition of doctoring here we call dibia, right? Medicine and dibia. In the Caribbean, they called obia, which is a corruption of dibia. These sort of ancestral or Igbo traditional medical practices have been transmitted into the New World and still form part of Afro-American and Afro-Caribbean culture today. I'm going to end so that we can have some time, by speaking very briefly on an important area that I think most of us may be familiar with, and maybe some of the young women here need to think about in terms of shaping their own identity. Many of us are familiar with the period of European colonialism in Africa. By 1903, when Lugard conquered the Northern Caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate, basically the North, most of what became the North, right, became incorporated as part of British colonial rule. But the British had sort of a different encounter with Igbo people. It took nearly 25 years from the Aro expedition, 1902, to the Ahara expedition, 1905, to many other expeditions, right, to the Ekumeku, resistance in Delta. It took more than 30 years for the British to subdue the Igbo people. Basically, annexing, pacifying one village after the other because of the nature of Igbo indigenous political system and structure. So, having established British rule, the British established what was known as indirect rule. In the North, it worked. The emirs became part of British rule. They already had authority. They were put in their place. In Yoruba land, the Obas became part of British administration. In Igbo land, where there wasn't a strong history of centralized authority, the British created what they called the warrant chief system. So they could come to your village and they say, my brother, you look like a strong man. They make you a warrant chief, And they are establishing new forms of authority that is not part of indigenous political systems and structures. So the Igbo, in many ways, resisted. And one of the most important forms of resistance came in 1929 with the 1929 Women's Revolt, right? Which occurred throughout eastern Nigeria. And women, in their thousands, rebelled against the British. What is important is not that they rebelled. What is important is what became the aftermath of that. That it is the Igbo resistance that shaped and reshaped British administration throughout Africa, not just in Nigeria. They gave up on the indirect rule system and in place of native administration. That's how they began to create native courts, right? and have local representations. How did the Igbo become central to reshaping British colonial policy? We got to think about that. How did this inform what became critical to understanding Igbo and other societies with the appointment of and commissioning of studies that today constitute what is known as intelligence reports? It was in the aftermath of the 1929 Women's Revolt. What I'm trying to emphasize is that the Igbo impact was not just local, right? It shaped British colonial policy throughout tropical Africa. I'm going to end by encouraging you to, if you haven't read it, the Igbo experience during the war gave us opportunity to think and gave us opportunity to show sort of the ingenuity of the Igbo people. I'm very sure some of you who are young will need to read about the Biafra War. But I want to point to a publication that came out during the war known as Ahara Declaration. I'm emphasizing that because today I read the Ahara Declaration as a manifesto, just as you will read every other manifesto, or the Arusha Declaration in Tanzania by Nyerere. What made the Ahara Declaration unique? It's not just about the political philosophy and ideas, but in it is sort of an indigenous development ideology that moves away from Western development ideas and ideals to one that encourages indigenous development relying on our knowledge and indigenous ideas. So, what is important, I assign this to my students in the United States. Read Ahara Declaration, read Arusha Declaration in Tanzania, and analyze how the indigenous ideas about development differ from Western development ideas, and to what extent this would have made a difference, right? If, for example, Biafra had succeeded as a country and as a state. Because by 1960s, Eastern region was the fastest growing developing economy in the whole of the developing world, including Asia. How did that happen? The Opera Revolution and things like that. How did that happen? Even though the war kind of ended that, development and ideas. What is important is what can we draw from these past ideas and Igbo contributions to the new world in terms of building a viable, right, society and culture in Igbo land? What lessons can we draw from this in understanding ourselves and our identity, and understanding what we have given to the world and the pride we can take in attempting to rebuild our own society looking on the past? So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to ask you to ask any questions if you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.